So it's
We're good.
recording.
You've already.
Why is it recording? Nothing's going on. Two participants. Kind of important.
Good young people.
All right.
Have a Merry Christmas.
This meeting to order. Will you please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance?
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call.
Mr. Lunder,
Here.
Mr. Johnson,
Here.
Mr. Bittner,
Here.
Mr. Wolf,
Here.
Mr. Shaboo,
Here.
Mr. Morris,
Here.
Mrs. Thompson,
Here. Approval of minutes from November 23rd.
So made. Second.
Motion made by Mr. Morris, seconded by Mr. Bittner. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Abstain.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Clerk, do we have any correspondence this evening?
I have no correspondence tonight, Madam President.
Anyone on council have any correspondence this evening? Mr. Morris?
Madam President, I had a rather interesting thing taped to my front door the other night. It's, and it's not signed by anybody. It says, "To whom it may concern." So it has come to my attention that elected officials that represent our city mentor on the lake at their leisure comment on behalf of themselves, their personal or political views. As I presumed it to be expressed through a social media platform, you have to forgive me, it's difficult to read. After looking at the video of said council meeting, to which our appointed administrator, Mrs. Bartoon, talked in short length at council. Question: at what point did the city administrator state resident was harassing another resident? Question: at what point did the city administrator address council that the resident is being sued by the city? The idea that third-party conversations take place in the streets of this city become a cease and desist order for neighbors to be conversational. At no given time was it expressed by city administrator, was spoken to be conveyed by elected officials on social media the same, unless there is more to this topic. And in the realm of this current and past administration, this is what is perceived. And it says sincerely anonymous. I've got a feeling somebody must have made a comment on social media, Facebook or something, that was relevant to this. As far as somebody being harassed after reading the minutes, I don't think Mrs. Bartoon said anything about somebody was harassing. It was just a statement.
And I'm not on Facebook, I'm on the city page. So.
Yeah. Well, I didn't see the statement, so I don't know. Would you like this?
Anyone else? Administrative department head reports. Mayor and Safety Director, Mayor Eva, good evening.
Good evening, Mrs. Thompson, members of council, the public here this evening. The 7th annual Salem School Headquarters will be held on Sunday, December 19th, starting at 5 p.m. in the community room here. Officer Tina has received donations from Marco's Pizza and Spuddy's Tavern. We'll have 16 students from Lake Elementary here. Volunteers are needed for the shopping at Target. We'll start here at 5 o'clock and shopping. We should be done back here by about 9 p.m. if anyone would like to participate. Patrolman Ken Wookty is retiring from the police department effective December 31st. Ken has been working with us here for the past 34 years. His last working shift is Christmas Day. We wish him the best. Mr. Wall, great job over the last 8 years. I know this is your last meeting. I want to thank you again. You started on the Parks and Recreation Board for us, and before you were elected to council. Also want to thank you for your help you did at Lake Elementary when we were tutoring. Wish you and your family the best going forward. Thank you. Civil Service Commission met tonight. We will give a full-time police officer exam Thursday, February 24th from 6 to 8 p.m. Fire department report for November. There were a total of 118 calls for service. 66 of those were rescue EMS calls. There were no camp, 22 fire service calls, and 38 invalid assist calls. That training, in the month of November, firefighter campaign and firefighter Corby completed the Blue Card Command Training Program. This consists of 50 online hours of study, followed by 25 hours of hands-on experience, for a total of 75 hours of training. Blue Card Command System is the fire industry standard for incident command, and it's utilized throughout Lake County. Lieutenant Conti, Lieutenant Langford, and firefighter Setback are all scheduled to complete the course in the month of December. Who's my report?
Thank you. Administrative Director, Ms. Bartone, good evening.
Good evening. Tonight's agenda, a couple of items I want to point out. The first one being resolution number 38. I'm not sure if you're aware, but our current labor relations management, Tom Grabarczyk, who's been with the city, retired a couple months ago. I did some research, called around, and the resolution that's on tonight is for IO2 law firm. It's Jeremy and one of his partners, Jason, who would also help out when needed. They will not be on a normal retainer like Grabarczyk was, but to be paid hourly. Currently, we do not have anyone on retainer at all, so I would appreciate if council would consider passing this tonight to make sure that the city has proper coverage in the event that we need something before the 3 readings would happen. The ordinance number 31 is to temporarily appropriate money so we can continue operating until the final budget passed. And ordinance number 33, there was just a small couple adjustments to some of the general fund to cover some expenses that were minor. And then 2 of them were for grant income that we received for the year. Fire levy, we moved some from the operations to personnel.
Thank you. Law Director, Mr. Lyons, good evening.
Good evening. Madam Clerk. First, I'd like to. Two, I'd like to waive my own personal reading rule. I'd like to thank Mr. Walker. During that time. Really, a lot of really good ideas. I appreciate the opportunity. Oh, normally I would wait 2 other meetings to give them that. I'm gonna wait that rule time. One time only. Okay, thank you.
At least you have an explanation.
Do we have any questions to administration and department heads at this time?
Mr. Morris. Ms. Bartone, any word yet on the audit?
Nothing officially. The interim middle people who had to conduct the audit submitted their response to the state. They feel that it should be okay. They don't have anything official.
Thank you.
Board and committee commission reports, planning and zoning.
Planning and zoning met on Monday, December 6th. On the agenda was a 5-year conditional use permit renewal for Lake Erie Lawn and Garden that was approved. Also, a lot split request for Adam Jorgensen, 7469 Southland, that was also approved. Big East Custard and All Occasion Limousine got the parcels combined, so that has been taken care of. That's all.
At this time, we will open this portion to the public. If you please step to the lectern and state your name and address for the record. Hearing none, we will close this portion. Legislation before council, resolution number 2021-R-29. Will you read it by its title, please?
Resolution number 2021-R-29, second reading. A resolution confirming the appointment of CT Consultants, Inc. as city engineer, affirming their contract, establishing their compensation, and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend.
So made.
Second.
Motion made by Mr. Johnson, seconded by Mr. Lunder. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson,
Aye. Motion for passage.
So made.
Second.
Motion made by Mr. Morris, seconded by Mr. Lunder. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye. Resolution number 2021-R-30. Will you read it by its title, please?
Resolution number 2021-R-30, second reading. A resolution confirming the appointment of Joseph M. Burley as city prosecutor and assistant law director, affirming his contract, determining compensation, and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend.
So made.
Second.
Motion made by Mr. Lunder, seconded by Mr. Bittner. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner.
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye. Motion for passage.
So made.
Motion made by Mr. Lunder,
Seconded.
seconded by Mr. Morris. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner.
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Resolution number 2021-R-33. Will you read it by its title, please?
Resolution number 2021-R-33, second reading. A resolution requesting the Lake County Auditor to make advance payments of taxes pursuant to Ohio Revised Code 321.34 and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend.
So made.
Seconded.
Motion made by Mr. Lunder, seconded by Mr. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
No.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Motion for passage.
So made.
Seconded.
Motion made by Mr. Lunder, seconded by Mr. Johnson. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye. Resolution number 2021-R-34. Will you read it by its title, please?
Resolution number 2021-R-34. A resolution authorizing recommendation to accept the One Ohio opioid settlement and enter into the participation agreement with opioid distributors Janssen, Johnson & Johnson, and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Lyons, does this have a deadline on it?
It does. This is really the first time we could put this on. It came out. I received notice. Mayor, they got maybe mayor behind this. Settlement. One Ohio fund. One Ohio program that we signed up for some year and a half, 2 years ago. 9 cents originally said it last week. And then they moved the deadline back. Now, December 17th, which
Oh.
is Friday. Yeah. So it is 9 cents.
Thank you. Motion to suspend.
So made.
Seconded.
Motion made by Mr. Johnson, seconded by Mr. Morris. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner.
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris.
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye. Motion for
So
passage.
made.
Seconded.
Motion made by Mr. Morris, seconded by Mr. Johnson. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner.
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye. Resolution number 2021-R-35. Will you read it by its title, please?
Resolution number 2021-R-35. A resolution confirming the appointment of Timothy Cavelli to the Community Reinvestment Area Housing Council.
Motion to suspend?
Discussion.
Yes.
I know Timothy Cavelli relatively well. He is of the highest character. I think he's going to do a fantastic job in all of these positions. I think really highly of the guy. I can't say enough good things about him.
Motion to suspend.
Second.
Motion made by Mr. Bittner, seconded by Mr. Lunder. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye. Motion for passage.
So made.
Motion made by Mr. Lunder,
Second.
seconded by Mr. Morris. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye. Resolution number 2021-R-36, will you read by its title, please?
Resolution number 2021-R-36, a resolution confirming the appointment of Timothy Cavelli to the Civil Service Commission.
Motion to suspend?
So made.
Second.
Motion made by Mr. Morris, seconded by Mr. Lunder. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye. Motion for passage.
So made.
Second.
Motion made by Mr. Morris, seconded by Mr. Shaboo. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye. Resolution number 2021-R-37, will you read it by its title, please?
Resolution number 2021-R-37, a resolution confirming the appointment of Timothy Cavelli to the Parks and Recreation Board.
Motion to suspend?
So made.
Seconded.
Motion made by Mr. Lunder, seconded by Mr. Morris. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Motion,
So paid.
Seconded.
motion made by Mr. Morris,
Second.
seconded by Mr. Shaboo. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Resolution number 2021-R-38, will you read it by its title, please?
Resolution number 2021-R-38, a resolution authorizing the mayor and administrative director to enter into a consultant agreement with Stefanik Ayuso and Associates LLC for labor relations, human resources, and/or other legal counseling services and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend?
Discussion, please.
Yes.
Ms. Bartone, are there any contracts coming up for renewal between now and the next council meeting? That you're aware of?
No.
And we've been working so far for a couple months without reversing, correct?
Correct.
So if this waited until the next council meeting, it wouldn't be the end of the world.
It could be.
So.
Because you never know when the world's going.
Very good point. I hope it doesn't end before then, or we're all in trouble.
He does more than good contracts.
At any point in time, we could have agreements, at any point in time, we could have an issue arise. And full-time fire is coming up, and I would feel better having them review all of the contracts going into this year. The sooner we get him on, if something happens between now and say January, hopefully it wouldn't. I wouldn't want to have to catch up after that.
I would also recommend to all members of council that some information be sent out about this, about them, so that you can do some independent research on it. And make sure it's somebody you want to bring on board.
Kind of what I'm thinking.
Do they represent any other cities?
I have some. I don't really know. This, but I do know that they're human resource. employment type.
Partner, City of East Lake, University Heights, Hudson, Hazel Township, North Homestead, Strongsville, Bend. Those are just the recent ones.
This, you anticipate this is going to be more costly or less costly than previous years? Sort of,
Well, even with Tom Grabarsik, it was fluid because we went years without meeting him. So he was always on the payroll essentially. Some years we went over that amount and had to pay him the difference. Some years we were under that amount, that minimum, like retainer essentially. They don't have a retainer. So we pay them as needed basis. So there's no minimum amount. Of course, have a cap. Hourly, without question, it will be more, but like I said, had raised his rates in probably 12 years. So everything is more expensive. I anticipate the first 2 years to be more expensive and then it's a taper off. But it comes down to, I had to do fact finding this year. I went to fact finding with full-time police, which costs a lot of money, both with labor negotiations and paying the union our half to do that. And we came out ahead on those fact finding, but it's very labor intensive. So if we got to that point, even with full-time fire this year, it would be significantly more expensive. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't.
Motion to suspend?
So made. Seconded.
Motion made by Mr. Lunder, seconded by Mr. Shaboo. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner.
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
no,
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
No.
Mrs. Thompson,
Motion for passage?
So made.
Second.
Motion made by Mr. Johnson, seconded by Mr. Lunder. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner.
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
I'm gonna abstain from this vote because I don't know anything about this company other than what I've just been told. Brief, which started off with, I don't really know these guys.
Well, that wasn't meant to say anything bad. I mean, I just don't personally,
I'm not taking it, it's just
yeah,
said something.
I
bad
just
about
don't
it.
personally know, but I know that they work for two groups that I've met. And that's personal.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
No, and for the same reason Preston quoted, I'd like to learn more about these before I'd say yes.
Mrs. Thompson,
Ordinance number 2021-0-31. Will you read it by its title, please?
ordinance number 2021-0-31. An ordinance providing temporary appropriations for current expenses and other expenditures of the city of Mentor on the Lake, Ohio for the year ending December 31, 2022, and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend?
So made. Seconded.
Motion made by Mr. Lunder, seconded by Mr. Johnson. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner.
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye,
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson,
Motion for passage?
So made.
Seconded.
Motion made by Mr. Lunder, seconded by Mr. Johnson. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner.
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
aye,
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye. Ordinance number 2021-0-32. Will you read it by its title, please?
Ordinance number 2021-0-32. An ordinance levying liens for expenses incurred for lawn maintenance and or culvert repairs.
Motion to suspend.
So made. Second.
Motion made by Mr. Johnson, seconded by Mr. Lunder. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye. Motion for
So
passage.
made. Second.
Motion made by Mr. Johnson, seconded by Mr. Lunder. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye. Ordinance number 2021-0-33. Will you read it by its title, please?
Ordinance number 2021-0-33. An ordinance to amend the 2021 appropriation ordinances and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend.
So made. Seconded.
Motion made by Mr. Johnson. I'm sorry, motion made by Mr. Lunder, seconded by Mr. Johnson. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye. Motion for passage.
So made. Second.
Motion made by Mr. Johnson, seconded by Mr. Lunder. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bittner,
Aye.
Mr. Wolf,
Aye.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris,
Aye.
Mrs. Thompson.
Aye. Any old business?
Council had a chance to review the email that I sent them about the CRA application.
Yes. The CRA application that was sent to us about Hickory, correct? Or was it Walnut? Hickory. Did everyone get a chance to review it?
Yes.
Any comments on proceeding? With that application?
I'm not sure what the problem is here, except he's, if I read the letter correctly, he's asking for the balance of his CRA. If he so applies, correct?
Not necessarily, because really, he's asking for the abatement in total. Because it was completed in 2019. His application doesn't, and his email doesn't specifically say he wants the 8 remaining years that he thinks it would be. And part of the problem, new construction would be 15 years. A rehab would be 10. He was told it was 10. I can't confirm what it was in that listing because the listing has since been updated. Writing.
And this is the one where he thought he automatically got it without filing the application.
Yes, he was sold the house thing under the assumption. So yes, he'd like the remainder of the 10 years, which
Right.
won't help him today. Mortgage payments.
That's what I meant when he said he's asking for the balance of this 8
Of the
years.
10 year, but the 10 year doesn't apply to new build. So whatever council would prefer to do is fine. I just would like to get back to this.
What was it for new build?
Generally, it's 15. But if he was sold under the assumption of 10, he doesn't.
It would be 13 years.
Theoretically,
I think that's what he should be granted. That's my personal.
Rest of council.
that's right, you guys are up there.
Discussion?
Basically, if I understand it right, he was put between a rock and a hard place with Wheeler. Wheeler is promising this, and that's not really what happened. And at that point, there was some gray area.
This was developed, like, the Realtor put this on
We advised the realtor to remove that from the listing.
So he did it anyway. This gentleman didn't have this house built for himself.
He bought it from the realtor.
He bought it from the realtor.
Pocketed the abatement.
It's just like the case we had once before.
Yes.
It's not like somebody decided they're going to build the house and
Because of the
accept the abatement. This was somebody that was, it was advertised because of it. I thought when we originally designed this, it was supposed to be like the person who's building, who was gonna get the abatement because they were building, not come along later and find it.
Exactly.
That was what it was intended for, in my eyes.
Yeah.
Or you're doing the improvements to do that for your home that you're going to live in, not to sell it and give it to the next person. This to me is
Probably
almost
would
on the
negotiate
realtor
price.
for doing false advertising. But in my eyes, if the realtor wanted to buy it and live there, then I could see that. I just,
I'm with you. I think it falls on the realtor. And
I think it was
that-
false
and I-
advertising.
And I think that he ought to go after the realtor.
That. That's my personal.
I'm guessing this individual would probably not have paid as much as he did. If it hadn't held up the abatement.
But also, the city has no responsibility of what the realtor puts. That's not our.
No, we tried.
Right. I mean, you
Right.
told them. or-
We asked.
Right.
But didn't, if I understand correctly, if I remember correctly, didn't we make this so that it was transferable to the? next
It's always been
person?
transferable, but the intent of the CRA was for owner occupied, so we would have never granted it to the builder. Yeah. That's where that little hitch comes in.
Builder had no intent on.
And the builder didn't apply for it.
Right, correct.
That was like a raw deal. But,
It is unfortunate. And, you know, you could find a happy medium, and I'm not suggesting anything. But again, buyer beware.
no, I don't think adapting it to fit this situation to find a happy medium is the right thing to do. I think it's, I just think it's something that we should deny. It's a request that we should deny. It's, doesn't follow the rules that we put in with the CRA.
And if we do it for one.
We're bound to follow what the ordinance says.
Right.
that's it.
You know, when you're buying a house, you should make sure that you have all those I's dotted and T's crossed. And,
agree.
you know, you're relying on something a real estate agent told you, but you don't have any legal documents that support that. I mean, that's kind of concerning when you're closing on a house. You should probably make sure that those things are actually there and those are true.
Holly, who is the real?
Is it Berkshire?
I think there was also multiple things done wrong here. One is without confirming that the person who got the abatement was actually going to be owner occupied. There was no confirmation of that either by the city.
I didn't
Well,
do
they
the
didn't apply.
application until this.
Yeah, they
That's,
didn't apply for it, so.
Right.
yeah, he didn't apply,
So
he
then
never
how
applied.
was an abatement granted if there was no
It
application?
wasn't,
What?
it
It
wasn't,
wasn't.
that's why he's here. That's why
Okay,
he's asking
because there
for
was,
it.
therefore, there's
There
no
was-
abatement done.
Right,
Okay,
right.
so I'm following you here. So therefore, he comes 2 or 3 years later and said, whoa, wait a minute. I thought I had an abatement and I didn't.
I was told I had it,
Yes,
yes.
and he didn't. He was paying taxes on a vacant property.
Because it takes up to 3 years for the
Yes.
county to catch up. Yes.
So all he's doing is following the guidelines, I think. He is the first owner occupant of that building. Is he not?
But he didn't improve the property. Like the point of the CRA is,
Yeah, I understand, but
you don't go backwards and say, I had this house built 2 years ago, give me the abatement.
he thought that this abatement had been applied. This is kind of a strange circumstance. And to quote Mr. Johnson, the purpose of the CRA is to build up the housing stock in the city, improve the value. And hasn't that done this?
The builder pocketed that 20 grand.
On the sale of private property?
Yes.
How did the builder pocket?
House saying that there's an abate, you're not gonna pay taxes for the next 10 years.
I know, but I don't know.
So the house is artificial.
Well, it could be. I mean,
Potentially. Yeah. there's no guarantee.
logically, it should be price tag. Or sometimes yes, sometimes no. Actually, to build a house.
What's your legal opinion on this, Mr. Lyons?
Well, I was gonna ask you some help. There's a lot of stuff. In the ordinance committee. I thought that we just recently updated the CRA ordinance. Didn't require a person, I mean, if a builder builds it, it would not knock them out. But they- and sold, still be eligible. Person who got it. would be on it. So that's what I thought that came.
That's what I thought we did too.
And so if it was marketed as a 10-year tear down, now we have lost value because there was value that was already there. It was not taken. That property had some work to it. That work would have been built into the lot. to the lot price, so I'm not sure what the lot price is. That's part of the- But I think that council realistically look at this. as being a model. Already get tax. To not lose tax. We will do it based on 10 years. That's not a strictly legal opinion.
So you're-
Through some of the facts of the situation.
Your suggestion is to base it on the 10-year. Right? And give him the balance that the 8 years that he's asking for.
So, the reason that the taxes stayed at the 144, it's also from 1 year. Right? So the taxes that are now up to the $230,000 based on the 2021 tax duplicate that is payable. If the house was finished in 2020, that's when it was finished, then it wouldn't have got on the duplicate in 2021, which comes out in 2022. So it makes sense that it was at that lower rate.
Sure.
It seems like it should happen faster, but it doesn't. And that he was getting that, the benefit of that. And so you could, I'm not sure when there is when there's an increase in value. That abatement goes into effect by law. If it goes in immediately, then it takes that 2-year period in order to get it out of the duplicate. 10 years seems. The builder didn't get any benefit other than maybe he was able to charge a higher price for that.
Right.
Lack of tax.
And that would be buyer beware of that portion.
Yeah. I mean, that's just a
The
function, that's just a
entire
function of
portion
the
of
market.
it. Yeah,
Right.
right.
I've never seen a study of how much that tax saving built into our tax rate. If it is, then really, it's the builder, like
I'm
I'm
not-
saying,
Personally,
is reaping the benefit.
I think I recommend sending this to committee to consider whether or not, where this fits with the exact legal language of the CRA. Make a determination of whether you want to make that community development or ordinance committee.
I think community development, I think would fit. Does everybody agree?
Then I think if you determine that that it doesn't follow the procedures and the law that we passed and put into place, then I don't think it's responsible for council to go directly against that. I think what you have to figure out is whether or not it does or does not.
So we will defer this to the community development.
Just to add to that question, circle, another issue there is whether.
I can't hear what you're saying.
Oh, I'm sorry. Another issue is whether or not that amended ordinance. I think under that amended ordinance, if I recollect it would be broad enough to cover. But council would have to determine this to be.
So that's the other thing that you have to discuss in the committee, is whether or not you're using the old version or the new version. The version that was in place when it was built, or when it was bought. Or there's 5 questions.
All right, any new business? At this time, we will open this portion to the public. If you please step to the lectern and state your name and address for the record.
7574 Dollar Drive, Mr. Gray. In the ordinance resolution you guys read off tonight about the One Ohio opiate. Let's Q&A that. Is the intent of the opiate to go back to the city's charges of applying certifications for not paying anything else that we've done? So we're going to recollect all these years.
So. Actually, as part of that one Ohio memorandum, I think any money that's derived from the state. I thought. I thought that most of them are in the region. Actually paid for. So I think that's like it. You're right, yeah. There's significant money that you pay city if this gets passed by enough municipalities. in order to do it. So we did this in a similar way back in July. Not the fight, not the Purdue pharmacy on that bankruptcy where we're working for $1 piece right now with another settlement we had. Everybody's signing off. Seems like that's the way this is going. There's significant dollars that Janssen / Johnson is putting across the country so that they can walk away from losses.
That's not right. 808 million. 808 million.
On this. That could be right.
55% spoke to education.
Formula. Some of it come to us that we're supposed to use programs, so.
So you have that special training for the emergency no special training for EMS for the utilization of administrative RTM.
They've all had, the way I look at, if there's a settlement and we're able to maybe support Lake County in training the residents, programs to help the residents of the county more than what the guys already know. They, between the police and fire, they all know already how to. Right.
We will close this portion. Announcements and settings of meetings. Board of Zoning Appeals, Monday, December 20th at 7 p.m. Organizational meeting of council will be Monday, January 3rd at 6 p.m. Ordinance Committee, Monday, January 17th at 6 p.m. And a tentative Planning and Zoning, Monday, January 10th at 6 p.m. Any other meetings? Oh, community development, yes. Do we want to schedule that now? Or after the organizational meeting?
After the organization.
Before we adjourn, I just want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year and stay safe and great rest of the holiday season. Motion, yes.
Before we adjourn too, I'd like to thank Preston Wolf for his years of service to this council. He's been very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And at that, I'll make the motion to adjourn.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Motion made by Mr. Morris, seconded by Mr. Wolf. Roll call, please.
Mr. Lunder,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Bivin.
Aye.
Mr. Mold,
No.
It's no bah humbug.
Mr. Shaboo,
Aye.
Mr. Morris, Mrs. Thompson.
Aye. We are adjourned.